One of the interesting things about liberation theology, though, is that even though it claims to be on the side of the oppressed, to be the one giving voice to the oppressed, the theology of the oppressed, in reality, it's not really developed by the average poor person. It's not representative of what the average believer in Latin America in the 1970s actually thought about Jesus or thought about the church or the purpose of the church. It was instead a theology of the elites, of the people with PhDs who went to liberal seminaries and were developing this theology for other PhDs from liberal seminaries. And so, just like many other theologies, it was not a theology of the people, it was a theology for academia. Now, there are passages that I think kind of throw a wrench in liberation theology. Consider Exodus 23:3. You shall not be partial to a poor man. Whereas liberation theology talks about, the preferential option for the poor. Or Leviticus 19, do not do injustices in court. Don't be partial to the poor or defer to the great. And so, this is a highly nuanced and complicated issue. When we talk about issues of equity, we can't just look at two Bible verses and think that we've solved it. The Bible has certainly does have a large ethic, as we went through in the last lecture, of giving voice to the most marginalized, the poor, the widow, the oppressed, of advocating for them. But on the other hand, to blatantly just somehow, feel okay with developing a theology that deliberately is especially for the poor also seems to be kind of counterintuitive. Isn't God, in fact, one who shows no partiality and who loves all people? One of my main critiques is not just from me, but from an important economist, Michael Novak, who asked questions about liberation theology in a book called Will It Liberate? And really, one of his biggest criticisms of liberation theology is that they do not like capitalism, but they never tell you what system they want to replace it. They never actually come out and lay out what will bring people out of poverty, what will improve people's station in life. So, as he says on page 31, revolutions create great armies, markets create jobs. And he points to, America was kind of the evil in liberation theology, the oppressor, and yet Novak asks why then have for generations people come into America as a way of being lifted out of poverty if it's considered by liberation theologians to be the one that keeps people in poverty. Here you can see how even though you have academicians writing books about the evils of capitalism, in reality the way that many of the poorest of the poor have lived is to try and either mimic Western development scenarios or in fact to join Western development markets by immigrating to countries that provide those jobs. He also has a very interesting syllogism here, or line of reasoning. He was saying that liberation theology written in Latin America started with the premise, our economy isn't just. And he would agree, yes, it seems like there are some incredible unfairness. If you look at the Gini index, the global index of inequality, Latin American countries at that time were the countries with the highest inequality. Premise B, our economy is capitalist, and so if their economy was unjust and it was capitalist, then there must be something unjust about capitalism. And then they would have a third premise, therefore an economic system to replace this unjust one would be socialism. And what he actually does is he says, no, actually, Latin American economy in the second half of the 20th century was in fact not capitalist. It was more feudal or pre-capitalist. And the government owned a huge portion of the land. There were a lot of protectionist policies, not allowing free market capitalism, not allowing the average entrepreneur to enter the marketplace and succeed. So if they were upset with their economies, it would not be, they would not want to say, look how capitalism has failed us. They should say, look at how, the feudal land ownership or, the economic system of Latin America at the time had failed them. Also, he has pointed out that typically the communist regimes were the ones that needed liberation the most. And I think really just nowadays, since communism is not the same sort of threat that it was in the 20th century when liberation theology was being developed and when Novak was writing his criticism, instead just to recognize that there are many causes of poverty, and liberation theology correctly pointed out one of those genuine causes, which is persistent to this day: power differentials and inequalities, oppression, which is just human nature, that those with capital will, it will be in their best interest to amass more and to not help those who are marginalized. But of course, there are many other causes of poverty, and when we get into Barry Asmus and Wayne Grudem's book on the poverty of nations, they'll go into about 79 different aspects that can lead to the poverty or wealth of nations. So just to summarize, liberation theology did effectively raise the consciousness of Christians regarding our action in this world. Are we to be involved in liberation? Is liberation about here and now, about life on earth? Does liberation, does the Christian activity of Luke chapter 4, of freeing the oppressed, recovery of sight to the blind, delivery of good news to the poor, is that social action? Does that involve economic systems and political systems? Yet, on the other hand, liberation theology required a unconventional hermeneutic of forcing text to be about Marxist revolutions instead of reading the text for to understand what the author meant. Unfortunately, liberation theology may encourage policies that actually hurt the very people that it claims to help, because in saying that it sides with the poor, it tends to be anti-development or anti-modernization. So it advocates a revolution but does not actually describe what that revolution would look like. Okay, this is the context out of which transformational development was developed and why it was so controversial, because you have evangelicals who were so convinced that the way out for the poorest and most oppressed was a free market capitalist democratic society. And they were, and that the work of Christians is primarily to show them the way to heaven. And yet they were being told by liberation theologians that the work of Christians is this Marxist revolution. And so what happened was evangelicals became afraid in their description of their missions work to their churches. They became afraid to say, we are helping the poor, we are on the side of the poor, we're giving voice to the poor. Because if they did, they would sound like they were anti-capitalist or like they were liberation theologians. And so any Christian thinker in the late 20th century who argued that Christians should be involved in social action was labeled a Marxist or was labeled a revolutionary. And so it became, very anxiety-producing and divisive whether Christians should be involved in the here and now. Should they be involved in helping the poor? Now, evangelicals have always helped the poor, but it became a sensitive topic to talk about because they were afraid of being labeled liberation theologians. Now, I think that transformational development provided the way out. It provided the solution for evangelicals to say, we do have a responsibility to break these chains of oppression, and yet we are not anti-capitalist, we're not anti-Western, we're not liberation theologians. And so that's really the background of this discussion.